Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Lamed Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadron Women of Long Island in honor of the birth of Orly Nechama Savitsky, granddaughter of our friend and co-learner Cheryl and Avi Savitsky. Miss Cheryl and Avi and parents, Dani and Ashira, see much nachat as Orly grows l'Torah, l'daf, l'chuppah, u'l'masim tovim. Today's daf is also sponsored by Tina Lam in memory of her mother, Pepe Sanders, Pesha Rivka Bat Gershon HaKohen Ubina. It has been 22 years and I continue to draw strength and inspiration from my mother's quiet faith, patience, wisdom, and fierce devotion to family. Okay, we're going to get started today with just the very end of where we were yesterday. Today we're going to have a lot of things in threes, okay, although one and twos, but we're going to start with three different sources to where we started yesterday, that tefillin is to be worn on the left arm. So we first saw this braita that said yadcha is small, and then the braita said, well, how do you know it's small? Maybe yad means yamin. Right? Generally, the default is right. So they say, no, here's three psukim they quoted, which we're not going to review again today, but they basically, in each pasuk, it said yamin on one part of the pasuk and yad in a different part of the pasuk, meaning there's yad and there's yamin. Okay, they're two different things. Yad must be left, yamin must be right. Rabbi Yossi HaChoram starts in the beginning of our daf. Okay, what is Choram? It's a bit of a strange name, not a name we're used to. So Rashi says he had a sunken nose, okay, which is a type of blemish. Other commentaries say there's no way that they called a rabbi by his blemish. That would be very disrespectful. Some people say it's the name of a place. Some people say it was his job. Okay, either which way, this Rabbi Yossi, whoever he was, the Choram, Omer, he basically is going to reject this interpretation. And he says, Matzinu Yamin, Shinikra Yad. What do you mean? We've seen in certain places where yad clearly means yamin, and we'll see why in a minute. Shenemar vayar Yosef ki yashit aviv yad yamino. Okay, when Yaakov was blessing his children, right? Yosef saw and he said, "Oh, you put the right hand." What does it say there? Yad yamin, right? He had the right hand on what Yosef thought was the wrong child, and right, not on the elder. So anyway, what do you see here? Yad yamino. There you see it's clear yad is yamin because it says so. Okay, we're going to stop the braita for a minute and come back to it. The Gemara kind of cuts off the braita for a minute and says, okay, well, that's a good point. Yossi Choram has. So v'idach, what's Tannaim going to respond to that? Yad yamino ikri. Yad stama lo ikri. He said, yeah, when the Torah says yad yamino, it obviously means yad yamino. But when it just says yad without any sort of word defining which yad, it means small. Okay, so that's not necessarily, or at least there's a possible retort to that difficulty. Now the Gemara says, now the Gemara goes back to a braita, the braita that we were in. So we started the braita with, first source is, yad is small because of the psukim. Rabbi Yossi HaChoram brings a possible rejection or different way of reading it. Rabbi Natan Omer eno tzarich. Rabbi Natan says you don't need that proof of when it says in the Torah yad, it must mean small because of all those psukim. But harehu omeo, there's a big theme we're going to see today where a lot of rabbis are going to say, Eino tzarich, you don't need that one, I have a better one. Okay, he says harehu omeo ukshartam uchtavtam. In other words, what he's basically saying is, don't bring it from other places. You don't need to go searching far and wide. What does it mean when it says yad? Just look in the pasuk itself. It says ukshartam uchtavtam. Tie the tzitzit, the tefillin, sorry. I'm thinking of tzitzit because we're going to end with tzitzit today. Tie the tefillin, and then the next pasuk is, and write the parchment for the mezuzah. Maktiva b'yamin, right? Most people wrote with their right hands. Even nowadays, most people write with their right hands. Maktiva, how are you supposed to do the writing? B'yamin, with your right hand. Af kshira b'yamin. Well, what are you supposed to do with your right hand when it comes to tefillin? This makes perfect sense why tefillin should be on your left, because the mitzvah is to tie them, and the tying should be done with your right hand, which is your dominant hand. V'kevan d'kshira b'yamin, if you're going to tie with your right hand, right, you're not going to be able to tie the tefillin around your arm, on your right arm with your right hand, so therefore, hanacha b'smol, it must be, this by the way goes with also the bracha, right? You put it on, that's not really the important part, it's the tying, it's what's important, the wrapping them. So, because of that, we're going to end up putting it on the left hand, on the left arm. Okay. So I said there's going to be three reasons, but in this braita there's really only two. We're going to get to the third soon. Before we get to the third, we're going to ask a question of Rabbi Yossi HaChoram. Rabbi Yossi Achoram Menachot b'smol manali. If he rejects the first opinion, so where does he get that you're supposed to do it on your left? Because the assumption here is nobody thinks you're supposed to put them on your right hand. So therefore, it must be he agrees. The question is, what's his source? And the answer is pretty obvious. Okay, he must have learned it from where Rabbi Natan learned it. Okay, even though he's not the one who introduced the second explanation, but he must hold that way because he doesn't agree with the first. Okay, now, the third is going to be introduced by Rav Ashi, but ultimately we're going to come back and see it in a Tannatic source. Okay, so Rav Ashi Amar mi yadcha. Okay, the word yadcha in the Hebrew language is usually spelled Yud Daled Chaf Sofit. But in the Pasuk, in Shmot Yud Gimel, in Pasuk Tet Zayin, it says, V'haya laot al yadcha, uletotafot bein einecha, and yadcha there is spelled Yud Daled Kaf He. So Rav Ashi says, and soon we're going to see that it's not just Rav Ashi, who's a much later Tana, but it's actually going to be, a much later Amora, right? He's at the end of the time of the Amoraim. He's the one who is attributed that he put together the Gemara, but it's going to be based on a Tannatic source, okay? Because then it seems weird at this point in the sugya. We have two Tannatic sources. All of a sudden, comes Rav Ashi with a third opinion, but we're going to see soon that it's in a Tannatic source as well. Yadcha ktiv behei. Right, so it has a hey at the end, which is odd. Keha. From there we get it we mean yad keha. What they mean by yad keha is your weaker hand. Okay? Al yadcha, right? That's put the tefillin on your arm, your weaker arm. Okay? That's the way we're going to understand it. Va'amar le Rabbi Abba le Rav Ashi ve'ema yadcha shebekoach. He says, why don't you read it as yad kaf chet and not kaf he? Okay, why would you do that? Well, first of all, you might remember we talked about the Sefer Torah and how the chet and the kaf and the hay looked very similar. And also in the world of drashot, we often have it where we take a hay and we darshan it like a chet. So we said, why don't you look at it like a chet? If you look at it as a chet, what does it say? Yad koch. Yad kach, right? Yad koch. Yad, strong hand. So why don't you would get to the opposite if you read it with a chet, to which he answers the obvious answer, which is Amalei, miktiv b'chet. It doesn't say chet. It says hey. And if you take hey, it's going to be weaker. Yeah, if you change it to a chet, it would be stronger, but it doesn't say chet, it says hey. So obviously, right, that's strengthening his position. And now they're going to say kitanai. This is the machloket Tannaim, whether you darshan it as yad keheh or not. Okay, and then we're going to see a machloket here, but it's basically going to add to our list of Tannatic sources a third answer. Okay, there's a machloket here. Second has to do with something else. Okay, it's just two different ways of darshaning what we have in this here. Two different ways of darshaning this word yadcha and what it's coming to teach us. So kitanai, yadcha behei, zo small. Okay, that's our opinion that we were looking for. Now we see it's a Tannatic source. So just to stop here for a quick minute, we have three opinions. Why is yad? Why do we put it on the left arm? I see you're asked about lefties. That's going to be the next sugya of the Gemara. Yad on the left arm. Why do we put it on the left arm? Because either it says yad, and yad in general is left. It's proven from Sukkim, even though Rabbi Yossi Achoram did not agree. Then we had ukshar tam, uchtav tam, because of the juxtaposition of tying and writing, just like writing's with your right, also tying is with your right. And again, you could say it like this: the main mitzvah is to tie, right? Even if you don't connect it with writing, but assuming, right, if the main mitzvah in general we do with the right, where the right is usually the dominant hand for all sorts of issues. So you're going to do the mitzvah of the tying with your right, and then that's going to then mean the tefillin is going to be on your left, or a drasha yad cha. Why does it say kaf he? Must mean ke he, weaker hand. But here's a different drasha on the word yad cha. Achirim omrim yad cha lerabot et hagidem. The word yad cha is written differently to include an additional case. Even someone who doesn't have an arm still is required to put on tefillin. Okay, so and tefillin of yad. Okay, they're probably talking about someone who doesn't have like from the elbow down. Okay, so they put it on the upper part of their arm. Tanya idach, there's another braita that shows that this is also a machloket Tannaim, whether a gidem needs to put on tefillin or not, is chayav. Ein lo zroa patur min tefillin. Achirim omrim yadcha lerabot et hagidem. So one source is to say if you don't have an arm, you're exempt from tefillin, obviously not tefillin shel rosh, but you're exempt from the tefillin shel yad. But others say, back to the same Acherim opinion, which generally we say is Rabbi Meir, Yadcha lerabot hagidem, that also someone without an arm would be obligated in tefillin. That's a total aside that we got to because of this drasha. Yadcha doesn't mean yad keheh, as our third source for how we know yad is supposed to be, that the arm is supposed to be the left arm. And yadcha lerabot hagidem, right? That's a different drasha on the word yadcha. And that in and of itself is a Tannatic debate, whether someone who has an arm that's cut off is chayiv in tefillin of yad or not. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we get to the left-handed person. Itil, that's a left-handed person. Meiniach tefillin biyamino shu smolo. So he puts it on the right, which is his left. Okay, for him, it's like, in other words, his right is like the left of other people. So there you have it. Someone who is lefty does tefillin on the opposite arm. Veha Tanya, but doesn't it say in a braita something opposite of that? Meiniach b'smolo shu smolo shel kol adam. He puts it on his left because the left is the left of everybody. We go by the mainstream, what the majority of people do, right? We what determines yad is determined by the majority of the people. So Amar Abai resolves this contradiction. He says, Kitanya hi b'shalei b'shtei yadav. That braita that says put it on the left because that's the left of the majority of the people is not actually talking about a specifically left-handed person, but it's actually talking about someone who's ambidextrous. Someone who's ambidextrous goes by the majority. If you're actually lefty, it goes by you put it on your right hand. Okay, we had this before in Zvachim. We had all these sugyas about doing things with your right hand, and in Din and Daf there was a whole shiur that Alana Stein-Hain gave about lefties in halacha, and it's a good article, and it summarizes, again, there's always different sugyot have different halachot about whether a lefty does it the same way as everyone else or differently. Okay, this particular issue, it's done differently. Tana debate Menachot. Al yadcha. Okay, our next issue that we're going to have 3 opinions about is where exactly you put the tefillin on your arm. Again, it's going to be just like the previous. It's obvious where you put it. There's no debate about that. The debate is what's the source. So we're going to start with a braita, and then we're going to get off on a bit of a tangent, and then we're going to go back to how exactly we know that this is the case. So, Tana debate Menachot. Al yadcha, zo kiboret. This is the bicep, okay? The upper part of your arm, that's where you put it. Bein einecha, zo kod. Okay, bein einecha is you're basically where your hairline is. Okay, we're going to see exactly how we get that and where exactly, but the kod is the crown of your head. So where exactly the crown of your head, we're going to understand that soon. So that's the braita. Heicha, so they say where is exactly the kod? It's where the head of a baby is very soft, right? We're always very careful with the head. There's the spot on the head that's very, they say be very careful not to touch it, right? The fontanelle, thank you for the name, which is actually much higher in the head than we actually put the tefillin. So the commentaries kind of explain, well, really, either we really don't mean exactly the fontanelle, or they just mean it's supposed to go on the crown of your head, and that's as far back as you can go, even though that's not really where we put it. It's a little hard to understand how that connects with what we do and what we're going to see in a bit. Okay. Now we get off on our interesting question for the day. By mine Plemo mi Rebbe. Plemo asked Rebbe the following question. Okay, Plemo was a student of Rebbe. He sometimes asked contentious questions. This is definitely one of them, or at least Rebbe took it as a contentious question. Misha yesh lo shnei rashim, be'eza mehem miniach tefillin. Someone who has 2 heads, on which head does he put tefillin? Okay, so Rebbe heard this question and was very bothered by it. He said, Amar le okum galei, either go put yourself in exile. Some people say what he means is go to some strange place where they have people walking around like that. We don't have that where we live. Okay, or kabel alachashamta, or excommunicate yourself for being disrespectful to the rabbis, basically. Okay, you're asking me such a ridiculous question. There's no way there's a reality to this question, and there's no place for this kind of question in my Beit Midrash. So basically, get out of here. Adahachi, in the meanwhile, what happened? Atahu gavra. In walks a person to the Beit Midrash. Amarle, and he comes and he says to Rebbe, It yali li yanuka. I just had a baby born. Di le tre reshe. He has 2 heads. Okay, So, right, obviously Rebbe was proven wrong because right then somebody walks in, right, what are the chances? It says, I have a baby born with 2 heads. Now, he's obviously not going to be asking about tefillin because no baby's putting on tefillin. So what did he ask? Kama bi'ina lemeitav lekohen. I need to do a pidyon haben. Now, it says in the pasuk, chameshet, right, you're supposed to give chameshet shkalim ligulgolet per head. Okay, so he has 2 heads. Am I supposed to give 10 shkalim to the Kohen? Okay, interestingly, Rebbe doesn't answer him. He's probably so shocked, right, after he just, kind of put his foot in his mouth. Atahu Saba. So an elderly person comes along, Tannatic, and he explains to him from a Braita, it says, Chayav litain lo eser slaim. Okay, when he teaches him, or it's unclear whether he quotes a Braita or he teaches him, you have to bring double. Okay, because it goes by the head. So the Gemara asks, does that really make any sense? V'hatani Rami Barchama doesn't, okay, we're on a complete tangent now into this case of Pidyon Haben. Hatani Rami Barchama brought a Braita that says, Mitoch shenemar, by the way, we're jumping ahead, right? This wasn't a question asked at the time, because Rabbi Barchama didn't exist at the time of Rebbe. Those were Tannaim, it was happening in Tannatic time period. He comes later, but he quotes a Braita that says, Mitoch shenemar padot tifteh bechor ha'adam. You're supposed to redeem a firstborn the firstborn of a person. Shomea ani afilu nitraf b'toch shloshim. You might have thought even if the child doesn't survive the first 30 days, because you do the pidyon after 30 days, so maybe you would have thought you still have to do it because it's still the bechor of the person, right? The obligation's on the father, and even if the child's not alive anymore, maybe you still have to do it. Talmud Lamal, but no. Why? Because the pasuk says, turning now to the next page, ach. Okay, it says actually, ach padot tifteh et bechor hadam. It doesn't just say redeem. It says but redeem. Now, ach halak. Okay, ach generally comes to say, well, not all the time. Okay, when not, if the child doesn't survive. What does this have to do with our case? Well, they assumed that a child who has 2 heads was not going to survive. This is what we call a treifa. So they said, why would you pay double? You shouldn't have to pay at all because a child who's not viable, okay, who dies within the first 30 days, you don't have to pay. So obviously this child that's likely going to die soon and won't survive, you won't have to pay either. To which the Gemara answers, no, that's not true. Shani hacha dibul gulgolet hala rachmana. Gulgolet is skull. That's what we said before. It says chameshet shkalim ligulgolet per head. Okay, so this is dependent on the head. And that's why you have to bring 10. Now, this actually means 2 things, really. Number 1, it means you have to bring 2. But that doesn't really address the question, which was, but the baby's not viable. So they're going to say, no, what they really meant to say, it means 2 things. Number 1, as long as the child is alive, it goes by the head. And if there's a head and the child's alive, then you're going to have to pay. Even though the child might be a treifa and might not survive another few months, but it doesn't matter. Right now, the child's alive. The exception to the rule was if the child had died before the pidyon haben kicks in, before the obligation. But if the child's alive, then you have to give it. And in this case, because it said gulgolet in the pasuk, it didn't have to say that. It could have just said, redeem your firstborn child, which is what it says in that pasuk. But in a different pasuk, it says legulgolet per head. Therefore, in this case, you have to give double. So that answers kind of both issues in one. Okay. That was our complete tangent about the head. Okay, now we're back to the Braita. Why they brought that right in the middle of discussing this Braita, I'm not exactly sure. Okay, but if you remember, before we quoted the story, this question, the Plemo asked Rebbe, we brought this Braita, Al Yadcha Zo Kiboret. It's saying where on the arm do you need to put it and where on the head do you need to put it. So now we're going to go in depth into this and see what are the sources for. How do we know it's on the kiboret, and how do we know it's on the kodkod, okay, on the crown of the head? So we're going to have 3 answers for the yad, for the upper part of the arm, and then 2 answers, it's going to be the one thing we only have 2 of today, 2, I think it's the only one, but 2 answers for why on the crown of the head. So Amar Mar means we're going back to quote something we quoted before in the Braita. Yadcha zo kiboret, minalam, where do we get it from that it's put on the bicep? Titanu Rabbanan, Al Yad Braita says, Al Yadcha Zo Gova Shebayad. Okay, Al Yadcha, on your arm, means the upper part of your arm. Now, this isn't a proof yet. This is just saying. When you see the words Al Yadcha, that is to tell you here on the upper part. to which the Braita in its classic Midrash Halacha way says, Ata omer zogova shebiyad u'einu ela al yadcha mamash. If I said put it al yadcha, what does yadcha really mean? Right? There's zroa, which is arm, there's yad, which is hand. You would have thought it means on your hand. Maybe you put the tefillin on your hand, right? It's weird for us to think about because you don't really imagine tefillin on your hand. How would you exactly do it? But theoretically, maybe you could. So how do you know that it's not on your hand? Amra Torah, hanach tefillin biyad, v'hanach tefillin berosh. Now we're going to make this comparison. It says put it on your arm or hand, put it on your head. Ma lahalan begova sheberosh, just like on your head, you put it on the top part of your head. Afkan begova shebiyad. Also here, you're going to put it on the upper part of your arm. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, so that's answer number one. Juxtaposition to the head. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, enot tzarich. You don't need that. Okay, I told you we're going to have this a lot today. You don't need that proof. I'll prove it from somewhere else. Answer number two. Harei Omer, vaya lecha leot. It should be for you in ot. What did we learn from this? A sign for you. Lecha laot v'lo la'achirim laot. It's supposed to be a sign for you, not for others. That means, basically, if you're going to put it at the top of your arm is covered with your clothing. So that means it's your own personal sign. Okay? Right? Sorry, it should be this arm, although I'm left-handed, so it would be that arm. But basically, it should be a noticeable sign for you on your arm, but under your clothes. Nobody sees it. This is the opposite of the tefillin shel rosh, which we already said. It's all v'nira, right? Ra'u kol me'aretz. Everyone's supposed to see that Shem Hashem nikra alecha, that God's name is on you, and that's why it has the shin, and that's why everyone's supposed to see it. But the yad is supposed to be underneath, okay? Just personally for you. So, and where's that going to be? If you put it on your hand, everyone's going to see it, right? Because your hand, unless you're wearing gloves, which generally people aren't, and you can't really put gloves on top of tefillin, the hand is going to be noticeable to everybody, whereas on the arm, the upper part of your arm, it will not be. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, no tzarich. He says, no, you don't need that pasuk. I'll show you a different one. Harei Omer, v'samtem et dvarai ele al levavchem ukshartem. Right? You should put these things on your heart. This is the pasuk right before it. That's really right. The words of Shema or belief in God should be in your heart. And then tie them on your arm. So what do we say? Shetehi sima keneged halev. They connect with the lev and the kshartam, that it should be opposite your heart. Upper part, right? Opposite your heart. And in fact, Rav Chia for Rav Acha Bered Rav Avia Mechaven Umanach Leila Hadi Libe. They made sure that the height of their tefillin matched exactly opposite their heart. Rav Ashi Avayativ Kameda Amemar. Rav Ashi was sitting before Amemar. This is on a different issue now. Habat Syria Biyade. He had a tear in his shirt on his arm. V'kamet Chazian tefillin. And you could see his tefillin. Okay, Amemar's tefillin were revealed. They were under his shirt, but then the shirt was torn, and you could see his tefillin. Amarle, Rav Ashi said to him, Lo savel amar l'cha la'ot v'lo l'achirim la'ot. Don't you hold? It's only for you personally in ot, not for anyone else. You're supposed to be covered. Amar le, bimkom lecha la'ot itmar. No, lecha la'ot is just designating a place. It's generally a place that's covered. It doesn't mean it has to be covered and no one else can see it. No, it's just saying we're on the arm in a place that's generally covered. Okay, the fact that I don't believe that really means it has to actually be covered. So those were our three opinions. Let's just review them. Either the tefillin shel rosh are on the top, therefore this is on the top of the arm, or it's a personal sign just for you, not for anyone else, so where your clothes cover it, or it has to be opposite your heart from the connection of levavchem to ukshartam. Okay, gova shebarosh minala. Now we're back to the second part of that braita. How do you know it's supposed to be on the crown of your head? Ditanu Rabbanan. Again, we're going to have the same type of braita here. Bein einecha zo gova shebarosh. Right, so between your eyes, that means, right, the height of your head. Ata omer zo gova shebarosh o eino ela bein einecha mamash. Maybe it's really literally between your eyes, which would basically be between your, right, basically on your eyebrows a little bit overlapping and the space in between your eyebrows. So they say no, because ne'emar kan bein einecha. Une'emar lahalan, this is where I told you we're going to have two sources here. So, ne'emar kan bein einecha v'ne'emar lahalan lo tasimu korcha bein einechem lemet. Okay, there's two psukim where between your eyes is mentioned. One is here, and one is you're not allowed to tear out your hair between your eyes. And ma lahalan begova shebarosh makom she'oseh korcha. You're not supposed to make yourself bald, right? When you're sad about a dead person, you're not supposed to do destructive things like pull out your hair. So where is that? We're not talking about your eyebrows or between there. We're talking about pulling out the hair on your head, where it could actually make you bald. We wouldn't call you bald if you didn't have eyebrows. So have hair on your eyebrows. So just like there, it's makom shoseh korcha. It's where you could be bald on where your hairline is. Av kam begova shel rosh, makom shoseh korcha. So that's what we do, a type of gzera shava. Bein einechem, bein einecha. We're going to say it means the same thing, which is where your hairline begins. Rabbi Yehuda Omer no tzarich. Again, I don't need that pasuk. I'm going to teach it from here. Okay, often, not in all the cases, but often it's don't bring it from somewhere else. I'm going to learn it exactly from those psukim. Okay, right? So now they're going to say, Amra Torah hanach tefillin biyad, hanach tefillin barosh. The Torah talked about tefillin biyad and tefillin barosh. Ma lahalan. Now this is going to be a bit of out of left field one. Okay, maybe I'll start before we even read it to give you some background. Okay, we're going to compare this to leprous marks. Okay, a leprous mark, there's different laws. If the leprous mark, how you determine if you have a leprous mark, different laws, whether it's on your skin where you have flesh, on where there's no hair, or maybe hairs. We have hair all everywhere, but not hairs like on your head, on your beard, on your eyebrows. Okay, that's a serious amount of hair as opposed to just hairs on your arm. So if, let's say, you have a leprous mark on your arm or your hand, so the sign is it's going to be a certain type of leprous mark, and if there's a white hair that grows, that's a sign that it's a leprous mark. If it's where you have hair growing, like in the place I mentioned before, then you're going to look for a yellow hair, and that's a different kind of leprous mark. So if you say, now the issue is like this, on your arm, where you put your tefillin, there's one leprous mark. There could be the possibility, which is the white hair. On your head, where your hair is growing, there's one leprous mark, which is the yellow one. Okay? But if you put it bein einecha, and then we're going to read this all inside, which is where your eyebrows are, now you have your eyebrows, which is a hairy part, and you have also the area in between, where there is no hair. So you're going to have two potential leprous marks that could grow there. So they're going to say that's not included. Okay, we're going to read this inside. And that's actually, we're going to end the whole topic of tefillin, which is a very strange place to end. But they're going to say the following. So Rabbi Yehuda says, so again, the Torah said, hanach tefillin biyad, hanach tefillin barosh. We're going to make a juxtaposition here. Ma lahalan b'mkoma ra'oi litameh b'nega echad. Just like tefillin shel yad, it's a place where there's only one type of nega one type of leprous mark that could be there, the one that grows white hair. Also in your head has to be a place that could only be a potential for one type of leprous mark, which is the yellow hair one. To exclude the real spot of bein einecha, what literally is between your eyes, where there is basar and se'ar, right? There's both flesh and hair. Di'ika se'ar lavan, v'ika nami se'ar tzahov. You could potentially have a se'ar lavan, or you could potentially have a se'ar tzahov, and you could have two different leprous marks, and therefore that's not the place. Okay, with that we end the tefillin topic. Okay, maybe it's a good time right now to do a review of our daf before we start tzitzit. Okay, which is going to be the next topic for the next bunch of days. So we started with 3 explanations for how we get that yamin is the hand you put the tefillin on. We talked about lefties who do it on the opposite hand. Okay, they put it on their right. Then we have where you put it, okay, on the head, on the top of the head, and on the arm, on the top of the arm. We had 3 answers for why the top of the arm and 2 answers for why the top of the head. And in the middle of that, we had the question about the 2 heads and got off on a tangent about pidyon haben for someone who has 2 heads. Okay, now we're going to go on to tzitzit. So we're going to start today with tzitzit, and from there we're going to get to the next chapter starting tomorrow about tchelet. And we're going to talk all about tchelet. We're going to have a lot to say about that. So now, arba tzitziot ma'akvot zo'etzo she'arba'atam mitzvah achat. Okay, we have to remember we're on daf lamed zayin, okay? On daf kafchet, that was where this Mishnah started. Okay, we've been off on a big tangent on this one, not a big tangent, but delving into a lot of mitzvot here. It started, if you remember, Shiva kanei menorah ma'akvin ze'etzeh. Okay, the 7 branches of the menorah. Shiva nerotea makvin ze'etzeh, where you hold the oil, need all the 7 there. Shtei parshiot shebemezuzah makvot ze'etzeh. From there we got into mezuzah. Then we had arba parshiot shebetfilim makvin ze'etzeh, which we dealt with. And then we had arba tzitziot makvot ze'etzeh. And I wanted to go back because they say, right, you have to have the 4 the 4 tzitziot, meaning on all 4 corners, there's 2 things of 4, right? There's also 4 strings. But we're talking here on all 4 corners you need to have. If you don't have on one, you're not yotzei the mitzvah. That's not tzitzit. Rabbi Yishmael omer arba'atan arba mitzvot. He disagrees. He says each set of strings on each corner is a separate mitzvah. Now, obviously, it's all part of one mitzvah. He doesn't count these as 4 separate mitzvot. But he says that you can have on one, and you can fulfill the mitzvah of at least having on one, even though you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of having on all 4. Okay, we're going to talk right away here about what's the nafkamina. And again, the number 3 comes up. We're going to have 3 nafkaminas, 3 practical differences between the 2 opinions. So I wanted to go back because the Gemara doesn't quote Rabbi Yishmael here. They just quote the first line of the Mishnah, but you can't really understand it without going back to Rabbi Yishmael. So and then, right, ... Rabbi Yishmael says they're actually each a separate mitzvah. My beinayu. What's the practical difference between them? Amar Rav Yosef, sadim b'tzitzit ikabenayu. Okay, one important thing to know about tzitzit is that they can be shatnez, right? They can be made of flax, linen, and with the tzitziot of tchelet, which are made of wool. Okay, so you can mix it. And that's because it says the pasuk of Gedilim Taseh Lecha, and that's juxtaposed to not to wear shatnez. And they say comes the mitzvah raseh of tzitzit and overrides the mitzvah lo taseh of kilayim, of wearing mixed clothes, right? Mixing those 2 things. So what's the nafkamina? What if you have a sadin, which is not really a sheet, but it means a beged made of linen, okay, a cloth, a shirt made of linen, that you added tzitzit to. Now, let's say you didn't add all 4 tzitziot, and you only added on 3 corners. So according to Rabbi Yishmael, they're isha mitzvah b'fnei atzman. So it wouldn't be a problem if it's a mix of wool and linen, because you're obligated in the mitzvah. You're fulfilling the mitzvah. According to the rabbis, you're not fulfilling any mitzvah until you put on all 4 corners. You can't wear that garment because it's kilayim, it's shatnez. Okay, it's a problem, right? Kilayim, just so you know the language, kilayim is the general mixed. Right? You're not allowed to mix animals, crossbreed animals. You're not allowed to have your vineyard with your grains. And it's also, you can't wear clothes that are wool and linen mixed together. The word for it generally is shatnez, okay? But the pasuk also calls it kilayim. So either one means, right? Kilayim is just a more general term that also includes among it kilayim of clothes. So now they say, so that's the first answer. Rava Baraheni Amar, Talipa alat chamesh ikabenayu. Now in Daf Mem Gimel, we're going to see that if you have a 5-corner garment, you're actually obligated in tzitzit. The question is, how many corners are you obligated to put tzitzit on? According to the rabbis, Tannaim, it's 4 only, because your obligation of tzitzit is 4 corners, and without that, you're not going to fulfill your mitzvah. And more than that, you don't need. According to Rabbi Yishmael, each corner is considered an independent mitzvah. So if you have 5-corner garment, and we already said it's chayav in tzitzit, then you're going to have to put tzitzit on all 5 corners. Ravina Amar, de Rav Huna ikabenayu. So Ravina says that this statement of Rav Huna, Judith, like from this statement, we're going to see a practical difference. What did Rav Huna say? If you're wearing a garment that has tzitzit that are not done halachically properly, then you're liable for carrying, okay, you're obligated for carrying in public on Shabbat. Because what are you carrying? Okay, the garment you can wear, but the tzitzit that are hanging down are problematic because they're nothing, they're useless. Okay, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah with them. So, according to this, now, if they're really not halachic tzitzit for whatever reason, strings, then of course everyone's going to agree that they're problematic. But within Rav Huna, you could have a nafkamina between Tannaim and Rabbi Yishmael. Let's say you were wearing a 4-corner garment with tzitzit on 3 sides, right, on 3 of the corners. So, according to Rabbi Yishmael, you're fulfilling a mitzvah. So you're not carrying on Shabbat. According to, and that would be kil chatan, right? And that wouldn't be, Rav Huna's statement wouldn't be relevant. But if you're Tannaim, that's shelo kalacha, because they're ma'achlin zeh, without the 4th, it's nothing, which means you're basically carrying these strings, and that's forbidden on Shabbat, and you'll have to bring a korban chatat if you did it unwittingly. Okay, that's the second nafkamina. Third nafkamina. No, that was the third. Sorry. We had 3 already. The sadim b'tzitzit, if it has 5 corners, and the talit that doesn't have tzitzit kalacha. Amar Rav Shisha b'reid Rav Idi. Now we're going to have another 3. We're going to have what if, this doesn't have to do with Rabbi Yishmael and the Tannaim, this is what if you did something to your tzitzit and it's no longer really a 4-corner garment. Okay, so let's see. Amar Rav Shisha, we're going to have three possible things that you could do. Amar Rav Shisha b'reid Rav Idi, Haiman de batzre leglime, lo avav velo klum. Okay, all these things, by the way, we're going to say, you didn't do anything. It's still considered a four-corner garment. Okay, what's batzre leglime? Rashi says if you cut one of the corners. Okay, so there's two ways you could cut the corner, what this means exactly. So you could either, okay, we don't know what it means, okay? It could either mean you cut on a diagonal and basically end up, instead of a corner there, right, you cut like a triangle off and you end up angled, okay? That doesn't really matter because in the end, when you make that angle, you have actually now two corners in the place of one, okay? Because you've basically made two new angles there. So they're still considered corners, and then you'd be obligated like a five-corner garment. That's one possible way of reading it. Another is to say, what if you cut it like coming opposite it, and you cut it in two, and then you end up with two more corners. You basically turn one corner into two corners, right? Not coming on an angle that way, coming on an angle the other way. And then you basically cut it, and you basically made like one more corner. And then again, we already learned that a five-corner garment you'd be obligated in. Okay, so either which way, however we understand it, I think I read by accident, I went back to the wrong line. But Amar of Shisha b'reid Rav Idi, Haiman de batzre leglime lo avav lo klum, shavye talit balat chamesh. Okay, I just didn't read to the end. You basically made this a talit considered like a five-corner garment, which we already said is obligated. Amar Rav Mesharshia. So now Rav Mesharshia comes with case two. Haiman de tzayre leglime lo avav lo klum. If you tied knots in all four corners. Okay, and now they're not really corners anymore because there's knots in them. So they're not exactly corners. Well, still obligated in tzitzit my taima, de keman de shar yadami, because a knot can always be untied. Okay, we view a knot as if it's untied. So therefore we view your talit as if it has four corners, even though it doesn't, or your cloak, whatever it is. Now, Tannaim, here's a source that proves this. There's a Mishnah in Kalim that talks about when does your kli become a vessel. Okay, or when is it not considered a vessel? It's always the determining factor. Is it going to be susceptible to impurity? If it's not called a vessel, because it's not significant what you did, then it's pure, and it will not be susceptible to impurity, even if you put something impure in it. So, here's the case. Tannaim, or if you touch it, or, depending on what the tumah is. Tannaim, kol chamatot hatzurot tehorot, chutz mishel arviyim. All that they used to make these they used to take hides and form them into bags, like kind of flasks that they would drink from. Now, when you took the hides, so sometimes there were open sections, you would tie them in knots, or you would sew them up, or you would do something to them. Now, if you tie them in a knot, that's not a very stable kind of flask. Okay, stuff could leak out, or the knot could come open. So it's actually tahor. Okay, it's not tamei at all unless it's the ones of the Arvim. Okay, the Arab merchants, they knew how to tie them very well. They did super excellent knots. They had a skill with it. That was already permanent. But a normal knot that a regular person would do, that's not considered anything significant. And that's why also here in tzitzit, if you tie your corners into knots, we're just assuming we view them as if they're undone. Okay. Third case, what if you sewed up the corners? Okay, Rashi, there's two interpretations here. One is you folded it, although that's going to come up later, so it doesn't really seem like that's a good interpretation. And the Rashi does say that. But what if you sewed each of the corners? You took them, folded them in. So now you end up with, right, like angled in, and there's no corner anymore because each one is folded in and sewed down. And you would think sewing is more serious than tying, right? Because it's more permanent. No, still not. Lo avav lo klum. You didn't do anything because in ita de lo mebaile. If you're really trying to say I'm cutting off the corners here and there's no corners on this baguette, well, livsok belishtia. You should have cut them off and thrown them away. Okay. The fact that you sewed it shows that you're planning to probably unstitch it and unsew it at some point. So we still view it as a four-corner garment. Obviously, the relevance for all these is that you're chayav in tzitzit on all of these garments. Okay. So the first thing we did was, what are the three nafkaminas, the three practical differences between Rabbi Yishmael and Tannaim? And the second thing we did was talk about all sorts of scenarios where you kind of turn your four-corner garment into really not really having four corners anymore, but it doesn't really matter because we're not going to view any of those changes as permanent. Or in the first one, it really was just like you were making five, and five is obligated anyway. The other two, it's just saying it's not really permanent, and therefore I'm going to still view it as a four-corner garment. Now we're going to end with Rabbi Yishmael Omer Ba'atan Arba Mitzvot. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel halakha ki Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, so we paskin like Rabbi Yishmael according to Shmuel, that each one is an independent mitzvah, but immediately the Gemara says, v'lei tilchata kavate, but we don't really paskin that way. Okay, we're going to finish with a story now. Ravina, which is relevant to this machloket between them and the fact that we don't really paskin like Rabbi Yishmael, because listen to this story. Ravina havaka'azal abatrei demar baravashi b'shabta derigla. Okay, the Shabbat of the regel means the Shabbat, probably it means the Shabbat before the holiday, when everybody was going to the drasha of the rabbi to hear the big drasha before the holiday. That was the most common time people would listen to drashot, and they went to hear the rabbi speak, and Mar Baravashi is walking home, and Ravina walks after him. While they're walking home, ifsi karna dechute, one of his tzitzit tore off of Mar Baravashi. Ravina saw it because he was walking behind him. Mar Baravashi had no idea this happened, and he didn't say a word to him. When they get home, Kamate Lebeite, when Mar Baravashi walks into his house and Ravina walks in with him, Amar le mehatam ifsik. He says, by the way, when we were down by that tree on this and this street, in that spot, your tzitzit ripped. So Mar Baravashi says, Amar le, mehatam shaditi. Why didn't you tell me then? I would have taken them off, because remember what we said. The tzitzit are now a problem because you now have these 3 strings hanging down, right? 3 sets of strings. All of them you're basically carrying on Shabbat. I would have taken my shirt off. I would have, walked home without it. So Ravina says to him, what are you talking about? You wouldn't have taken it off, and you wouldn't have had to take it off because har marmar doesn't someone say, or maybe you said, I'm not even sure. Sometimes mar means you said it. I didn't check. But gadol kvod habriot shedochet lo taseh shebetorah. You might remember we learned this way back in the beginning of Masechet Brachot. Kavod habriot, respect for humans, is more important that it even overrides a mitzvah aseh in the Torah. So if you, even a lo taseh in the Torah, a negative prohibition. So you're not allowed to carry in the public domain on Shabbat. But kavod habriot is worse. You're going to take off your shirt and walk around without a shirt in public. Right? That would have been humiliating. So that's why I didn't tell you. To which, say, Tiragama, what was Mar Baravashi thinking? Well, he explained it as Rav Bar Shva, Kamei de Rav Kana. Rav Bar Shva, in front of Rav Kana, explained that line and said, no, don't take that literally. That kavod habriot is so important that it overrides a negative prohibition for the Torah. No, it overrides one negative prohibition in the Torah, which is Belav de lo tasul. The prohibition of don't do differently from what your rabbis tell you. Meaning, in other words, this overrides anything the rabbis tell you, anything that's rabbinic, but not actually Torah law. Okay, it's saying it is a lo taseh, but it's one lo taseh, which is not listen to your rabbis, which means anything rabbinic it will override. But this was Torah law, because it's carrying in public, and Rishut HaRabim, in the public domain, on Shabbat, and that's why kavod habriot wouldn't have overridden that. I would have had to take my shirt off. Okay, what we're going to see tomorrow is a different version of this story, and with that we'll end the chapter and then start with the tefillin. Okay, so again, yad yamin, right? How we do the right, how we know it's the right, the left hand, not the right hand. For lefties, it's the right hand. The al yadcha and al right on your head and on your arm is the top part of your head, the crown of your head, the top part of your arm. What are the sources for that? Then the arba tzitziot, the nafkaminas between Rabbi Yishmael and Tannaim. 3 cases where you might do something to your tzitzit where it doesn't really matter. You're still obligated, even though you don't really have 4 corners anymore. And this, do we paskin like Rabbi Yishmael? Well, it seemed to say yes, but then the Gemara says, no, we don't really. And look at this source where this story where Ravina pointed out to Mar Baravashi that one of his tzitzit broke, and theoretically, he should have taken off his shirt. Ravina didn't tell him because he didn't think he needed to because of kavod habriot, and Mar Baravashi thought, no, kavod habriot doesn't override a Torah law. And tomorrow, like I said, we'll see the other version of that story. Wishing everyone a good day and a chodesh tov.